Hey there, welcome to another tutorial video, and this time we're going to tackle a futuristic character. I call it the Death Trooper, and what's unique in this tutorial is that we'll be mixing a little bit of Blender work to create a nice base. And if you don't know what Blender is, it's an amazing open source free 3D software that you can use to model, rig, pose, and render. And I think it's a really great tool for artists to level up their work basically. So what I have on screen now is a free model that I downloaded off TurboSquid or whatever site suits you. I used Blender's basic rig and created a simple bone structure and did a automatic skin bind so that I could pose my soldier into a more interesting character pose. I also have some meshes that I popped into my scene, notably a skull because I do want the skull design on the head, a knight armor that I purchased off TurboSquid because I do like the pieces of gothic armor that had, and some free 3D Kitbash library parts that you'll see me use sparingly in this scene. So my initial goal right now in Blender is try to get a convincing character pose without too much work. In this case, we're designing a character, and a huge part about what makes a character design successful is the accuracy of its proportions and gesture. You can get a long way with a relatively simple design, but a well-executed character drawing in the sense of proportion and anatomy. So using a 3D model really expedites that entire outcome and gives you really good accuracy for very little effort. So now that my character is somewhat posed up, I'm just putting in my skull 3D model really quickly, and I'm just intersecting that mesh in. And this is generally how I like to work in 3D. It's fairly rough, fairly simple or lazy. In fact, I use very little tools to try and create the feeling that I want for the character. So it's very similar to playing with a doll or a toy or action figure, where you're just gluing things in place and you're kind of cutting them up if they don't fit. So it's not so much like a very detailed measuring kind of a deal. It's really just almost like photo bashing, where you're just kind of putting something in, letting it intersect, and just evaluate it purely from a design perspective. So I have this idea of creating a kind of like a wasteland soldier, and it was only nearing to the end where I decided to run with a more coherent theme. The name Death Trooper honestly came in much later, but it did drive the entirety of the design, and that's one of a very good way to jumpstart your design process is perhaps just coining the name of the character early. You want to try and be as in-depth with who and what your character is, especially by name, because I do think a character's name tells a lot about the character or person behind it. So with the word Death Trooper, what strikes me immediately is the idea that you have a character that is maybe perhaps undying or in permanent servitude to whatever armed force that this character is assigned to. And it's also a bringer of death, right? It's not good news when you see this character coming in. I also am working off a fictional military group that I call the Carrion Guard. And a carrion bird is also something that symbolizes death. They pick the corpses of dead animals and people, and basically they're kind of like the it's not good news when you see carrion birds as well, and that's generally the feeling that I wanted to give this design. There wasn't any outright brutality, but I wanted a generally quiet design approach where you could feel the character was experienced and skilled, and still grounded. I guess that will be another keyword that I wanted to achieve. Just a nice grounded military design with hints of future tech and my personal preference of tech occult. So as you can see, I'm just very quickly kind of mashing all these parts in to try and get the volume of these armor pieces right. And it's very easy to get over complex with your 3D models. And it's important to remember what your goals are at every stage of your design process. In this case, what I'm most interested about is how can I capture the base proportions and base pose of this character that I have in mind as accurately and as quickly, hopefully, as possible. Although proportion does go hand in hand with design, it's really just shapes. Where do I put the big shapes? Which section gets the bigger or smaller shape? Are the shapes symmetrical? Are they not symmetrical? These are the initial questions that I'm trying to solve with this rough blockout. There's nothing about detail. There's nothing really about strong storytelling yet. It's all about graphic design, putting shapes together so that they complement one another, and making sure the pose has nice center of gravity, as well as good offset in rotation. So if your shoulders are rotated clockwise from the top, it'll be a good idea if your waists are rotated counterclockwise from the top. And now you can see I'm selecting some nice chunks of geometry from this Kitbash set. And Kitbash parts are a really great way to add surface variety really quickly, because these models are highly detailed and they tend to have their own story almost. They're a really quick way of introducing new surfaces onto your model, onto your design. The only thing I would say, of course, is unless it's intentional, try not to use too many meshes or too many unique meshes, because what might happen is that your design would appear messy because there's no unifying shape language present. Of course, unless that is your intention to create like a pure messy junkyard warrior, for example. But my thought process for this character was that there was a wasteland explorer perspective to it, so I would say maybe 20% customized gear and then 80% is still stock, because this character is part of a combat force or combat group, so they would have their respective how should I say, their respective gear or loadout that would be present. So I'm consciously thinking about this as I'm fooling around with this mesh here. And I've added this backpack element because I wanted well, first of all, I wanted the silhouette to pop a bit more. But I was also thinking about potentially how this character could survive in the wasteland. Might have some purification backpack, or maybe this is I think in the end it ended up looking more like a communication / mortar anti-personnel propellant in the backpack, which I think worked quite well. I do try to think about it as much as I can from a surface level, but I'm pretty relaxed when it comes to this kind of things. I'm not too much of a military accuracy person. For me, what matters the most is a visually believable design language. So I've added the sword because I've always loved the idea of knights in the modern day setting. So knights with automatic rifles, and there's just something romantic, visually romantic about having a melee weapon like that on a design. So I'm rather crudely deleting some faces on the head here because there's a lot of junk geometry that I don't need from the previous model. And I'm not too concerned about whether the meshes are overly messy and whatnot, as well as you can see some intersecting errors, which I would try to clean up, but I wouldn't stress too much on it. This model, first and foremost, is only there to serve as a perspective proportion guide and eventually a lighting guide. I also like to introduce you to an idea called the PSD system, similar to the Photoshop saving file, P, S, and D. I think it's a great way to evaluate or approach your artworks with these three mindsets. So what is P and what does S and D stands for? So P stands for proportion and pose if it's a character, which is exactly what I'm doing now. I want to make sure I nail the proportion and pose, and that also involves roughly the design, but a design with a very strong proportion-driven mindset. Meaning I'm really concerned about big shapes, big silhouettes, and if possible, narrative silhouettes to help tell a story. And when you're working your proportion and pose, your mind or your brain or your artist's mind should be 100% only concerned in achieving a good pose and proportion. You can compartmentalize your design concerns, you can compartmentalize the maybe narrative approach, right? So it gives you less concerns to juggle with, and you're smartly limiting your decision making to just core elements of your design. Only once you're happy with your proportion and pose is when you start to think about surface or materials, right? That's the S in the PSD. So S stands for surface. And surface means the geometric quality or the 3D shape present in your design. Because all designs are ideally supposed to look 3D. Even 2D artworks or 2D characters are meant to replicate how something would look like in 3D. So to achieve good 3D forms, you must have a clear and easy to understand surface. And that is within under the umbrella of proportion, right? So whatever surface you plan to add or improve on will fall under that already set proportion and already set size. So when you're thinking about surface, you're thinking about how an armor could be sculpted, how a helmet would look like from multiple angles. So you're thinking more about 3D form with respect to design. Surface also covers the textures and materials, whether I like to think of it from a very simple logic perspective, which is whether the material is hard or whether the material is soft looking. So hard looking or soft looking. Most materials in this world will fall under these two visual categories. So for example, softer cloth is generally visually softer, unless of course it's like a nicely pressed suit, then it will be a harder shape. Generally armors and whatnot are hard visually, and they should be, so whatever material properties you tend to give them should be promoting that surface property. And I do believe that when you have the right variety of hard and soft visually looking materials on your design, be it a 50-50 percentage of hard and soft, or preferably a uneven perspective, uneven proportion, meaning 70-30, 80-20, you can create a much more dynamically balanced piece of design. So in this case, it's actually dominantly soft materials on this character. He is having a lot of cloth pieces, like you see me adding to the loincloth now. You also have dominantly soft Kevlar body armor, soft pants, soft sleeves, and there's just about a good 20% addition of armor everywhere. And you can see this example quite clearly in the shoe. It takes about, I would say, 30% of the total size of the shoe is a hard armor. And working with percentages like this, I found that it helps me design faster. Not necessarily better, but it just helps me make decision faster, which I feel is one of the biggest drawbacks to any designer. Is just the ability to decide fast. I think there are many people out there who have natural talents and amazing taste in design, amazing taste in reference, but if you are slow to decide on things, or if you're constantly backtracking from your decisions, it would mean that although you have a good taste, you don't have a strong discipline or a clear mindset about how to approach your design. And for me, coming up with techniques like working with percentages helps me bypass this. So if I know that I'm going for a range of 30% armor to 70% fabric, that leaves me about 25 to 35% leeway in between. Out of the 100 decisions that I'm making, very likely 99% of those decisions I can make right on the spot, because as long as it hits the 30-70 rule, and I'm good. And it will be that last 1%, maybe the last 5% is when I would agonize over and make sure I get it right and make sure it fits my feeling and my mood about how I want the character to look like. So P and S, proportion and surface, and D is the final one, which is details. So I'm only concerned about details at the last stage, because details or decals like stickers and logos and descriptions are the icing on the cake. They're equally important, but should only be concerned about at the end. And to me, details includes hydraulics or little tiny pistons that you put a little scratches in here and there to tell story or to tell detail, to tell scale. But they should be only worked on at the end. So this hierarchy of dealing with your work does a few things, right? First of all, it allows you to focus on important problems as they come. And they force you to solve the bigger problems first as well, because your pose and proportions dictate your entire design. Hulk is a character, Hulk from Marvel, the Marvel comics or the Avengers. Hulk is essentially a naked character that is purely designed by the proportion of his muscles. And fans of Hulk can even distinguish the versions of Hulk just purely based off his anatomy, without seeing any dialogue or writing, or even if you swap the costumes for that matter, you could tell which is a World War Hulk or which is a Mark Ruffalo Hulk, just purely based on the proportions of his face and proportions of his body. That's the power of proportions. Car enthusiasts can tell you the year of a Porsche based on just the proportions of the body, right? And we are really in tune with that. And that's why it's the first and most important thing that you want to nail: proportion and pose. Surface and materials are the second, because what we're trying to create, even though something is grayscale, we live in a dimensional world. So dimensional world is tactile, right? You want to be able to understand the surface that you're touching. So having good materials would allow your design to react under lighting well, will allow your design to change and affect and be interesting in different lighting scenarios. So it makes it more valuable as a design from a moving or film perspective. Finally, we have detail, right? Because if you don't know what your shape is, you don't know what surfaces demand, then you shouldn't begin on details just yet, right? Details are about drawing your audience closer in, about getting them excited. Details are awesome because people love looking at details. They give your piece almost they give your piece weight, I would say, or bonus points maybe. But they can only work with a very strong foundation of proportion and surface. So that's kind of like what I wanted to really iron out in this lecture, which is the PSD system: proportion, surface, and detail. So in this tutorial, I think I spent about an hour, or approximately an hour. This video is sped up, by the way. It's sped up by twice, so it's an hour and a half long clip, give or take. And the actual tutorial I did this in my class real time was about 2 hours and a half. And then what I did later was spend about 2 hours in my studio, with good music, and just finalize all of the details. So essentially, I did all of the P and S, the proportion, the surface work, or 50% of the surface work in the school, in the classroom. And then the remaining surface and material and detail work in my studio. So you're looking at about a 5 to 6 hour work in total from the final piece. So my first hour really is just all in Blender, and you can see me, I'm actually just creating some basic materials and some simple lighting. I try not to get too deep into the materials. I mean, obviously you can go really into Blender cycles, or Blender EV for that matter, and really work in those materials. But I find that sometimes I use more time tweaking the materials and actually getting results from my design. So I try to juggle between the two. Some materials which I think I am not yet skilled enough to paint outright in Photoshop, I would create a good representative of that via Blender. And I think that is basically my decision-making process. If I don't know how to paint something, then I would need to either get a good PhotoBash reference for it, or I would have to make sure that the Blender output or the Blender render of it would be good and accurate and detailed. So in this case, I was pretty sure that I don't think I can achieve this level of lighting that I wanted for my design without the help of a good 3D render, which is why I'm using Blender for it. But with respect to color and detail, I was definitely going to just PhotoBash my way and paint my way through it, because it's just more efficient that way, more fun, more productive. So I initially assigned his armor to be red, just because it's an easier color to work with in Photoshop. Meaning I could use a hue and saturation selector and just select all the reds to change the color easily. If I were to use something like a blue or gray, the gray would blend in with all the other gray materials, and that would just make it difficult for me. So this is a nice little trick if you're working with Blender. You don't necessarily have to decide on the color, because you want to leave that freedom up in Photoshop. But what you can do is give yourself a nice platform to work on. So assign slightly brighter color materials to your character when you render it, just to make it easier to select them. We call it in the industry the clown pass, because what you end up is almost a character that looks colorful like a clown. As funny as it is, what makes it useful is that it's very easy to select materials when the colors are very clear and vibrant, and you can easily desaturate a color in Photoshop. But when you have sufficient data from the render, But if you start with a dark desaturated color, it's quite difficult to crank it back up because the data is not present in the render anymore. So I'm quite happy with this 3D blockout, and I'm just beginning to assign a light to it. And what I'm looking for is just making use of Blender's really good cycles render. And all I'm using is just one light. I want a strong, direct key light. And this is my advice for anyone who's starting to do lighting in Blender. Use one light first. Really. There's no need to play around with 5 or 6 because it makes it very difficult to troubleshoot what each light is doing. You gotta have a clear main light that's driving the core highlights as well as the core shadows. If you start to play with too many lights too soon, what you probably end up with is a very muddled up picture, very muddy lighting, very inconsistent, unclear lighting. And especially when you bring this into Photoshop, it loses its lighting even further. As you start to paint over, you start to drop textures in, and these textures don't have clear lighting on them. It starts to get muddier and muddier if you're not careful. So it's always a good idea to just start with one light and get really comfortable. Be like an expert with just that one light. Get the shadows work exactly how you want it. And then you can start playing around with different colored lights in that sense. So I'm just using an area light for this because I prefer how the gradual fall off it delivers. And I've made the scale of the light quite small so that I get a nice hard shadow. A larger light would entail almost like an overcast lighting setup, so you would get something a bit softer. But for this, I wanted to make the most out of the Blender render and really show off some nice high key lighting. So we're about an hour in real time, and I've just begun to basically set up my camera. I'm gonna render a picture with a transparent background, and I'm gonna keep that ground mesh in place because it is giving me that nice cast shadow which I want. And I'm using quite a long lens. I think it's about 150 mm, just to get a nice clear view of the character without any lens distortions. Initially, I was thinking about adding a color to the ground to hopefully maybe color correct this down the road, but ultimately I just stuck to something simpler. It's very easy to overcomplicate things in 3D, I might add. So it's best just to keep it simple. Add the complications in Photoshop instead. So now that my image is rendering in the background, I'm just going through my Pinterest boards as well as my reference libraries and just starting to compile some usable textures for the photo bashing stage. I have a decent military folder, which I use quite regularly, as well as a mechanical folder. And these are just images that I save over time. They have different sizes, some fairly large and some quite small. And what I'm looking for is parts, right? I'm looking for things like pouches, textures, surfaces, anything that was missing in my original 3D model, which is a lot, right? Because my model now, as much as I love the proportion and the pose, is substantially lacking in material and surface, right? The 3D form is still rather rudimentary, so I need these images to enhance the 3D definition of my design. So I do find that 6 scale or 12-inch military toy photos are a great resource for textures because of how consistent the photos are. They're generally quite high or medium resolution. They're always with a overall even lighting, so it makes it very easy to relight or color correct. So you tend to see a lot of those in my folder. So whenever I grab my textures, I tend to look for three things. One is real world references to build up believability. Second is what I call textures that I think can help me rebuild a section properly. So let's say it's a complex geometric surface, like a cylinder that's curving to basically the forearm of this character. Getting a texture like that has the correct 3D shape would speed up my work so much. It will make my work on the mesh or the surface so much more convincing using a texture. And then the third is just micro details. Things that I know I could photo bash in to add resolution and visual interest to the design. So three things in my textures: photorealism, 3D forms, and then finally detail. My main render is done, and I've started to render the back view as well. And I'm just creating a new document in Photoshop, which I'm gonna basically start to do the actual character design section of this concept. I like to use a high pixel count, so I believe this is about 6,000 by 3,000 pixels, but a low PPI or DPI, so it's only 72. That's a nice tip if you want to keep your file sizes manageable, but still have a lot of pixels and a lot of resolution to work with. So it's always quite interesting because I'm recording the audio after the fact, right? So this video was recorded using OBS at the school, and they didn't have a mic or a webcam with a mic, so the stuff that I was sharing there, I basically only the students got it. It's always a weird thing, kind of looking at how you work, or a recording of how you work, as well as making sure I have enough things to say during this basically 1.5 hour video. So forgive me if I go quiet for a few seconds, purely because I'm just not sure if I need to say anything at this point. But I'll do my best to fill up with as much content as I can. So here I'm just, the moment I put my character in, I like to build a very rudimentary studio lighting setup. So this little gradient thing that we're going on in the background here is meant to represent a studio backdrop, similar to what you might get for a photo shoot and whatnot, where you have a piece of tarp or paper that's going from the ceiling all the way to the ground, and you just get this very nice soft gradient. I like to design my characters with 3/4 front and 3/4 back, as well as a close-up on the head. I do think the face of your character, especially if it's a humanoid character, really says a lot about your design. And it's a character on its own. You want to treat the face and all the facial features as a character, as much importance as how you would treat the perspective and proportions on the entire body. So essentially you're designing two characters, right? We are so good at judging faces because if you think about it from an evolutionary standpoint, the way our brain works is like we judge two things. One is the body language and silhouette of a person. So if someone's walking really aggressively towards us, even if we cover their face, we can read what they might do to us when they get close to it. They might hit us, right? And we're so trained for that because we can read this even in animals. And the second thing we're really good at is the proportion and the expressions of the face. right? How the eyebrow contorts, how the eye contorts, tells us a lot about what we feel in the character or how we read the character. And this is the kind of thinking that I apply even to the helmet design for my character here. The LED eyes on his face is thin and small. It's almost like he's squinting. And I want that. I want that determined look, even though it's a mechanical eye or it's just a slit. I want it to feel like it's a person squinting, like a person focusing on something with heavy focus, right? Heavy intent, I should say. And that even though it's I guess this is why I love putting skulls on my designs. I think it's such an immediate reaction. Like, you know that it's almost bad news whenever you see a skull, because ultimately it represents death. And that probably explains why it's so popular in modern designs, right? You see skulls in almost everything. And I do think because it works, it's whenever you design something, you're always looking for universal traits that humans can react to. So the more you have that, the more reachable and the more easy to understand your design becomes. And that goes hand in hand with believability, because a person needs to understand and connect with your design for it to be believable in the first place. So if you're designing a fictional character like I am now, this is a fictional soldier, I'm juggling between which parts are clearly fantasy or science fiction, with which parts are universal human truths that people can rally behind so that they can enjoy the fantasy aspects but are fully reassured with the realistic aspects. And that creates a fun, approachable design, in my opinion. So of course there are times where you need to pivot the scales to either one side, either to the fantasy realm or either to the realism realm. But I think it's highly important that everyone is conscious. You're always conscious about this push and pull whenever you're creating something. And that there's probably no such thing as a bad design per se. It's just whether that design is appropriate to what you're trying to achieve narratively or visually. So I'm beginning to clean up my render, right? I've attached and basically you can see I've just merged the 3/4 front and 3/4 back into one layer, because I don't really like to mess around with too many layers. And I'm just using my smudge tool. I love using the smudge tool. It's currently set to 100% everything. So it's just literally pushing and sliding pixels all around. But what's great about it is that you preserve the existing values and hues of your underneath image. So I don't need to color pick on anything. It's just one brush and I can just move things around really quickly. And I love using this to reshape silhouettes and just clean up some defects in my render, which are plenty. I'm also solving the main issues first, which is the fact that the hands are not posed. Because I didn't bother to rig the fingers, so I kind of have to mess around with it in Photoshop. And looking back, this hand actually gave me a lot of issues. Dominantly because I think it was the only part that was really photobashed, and it was very obvious that it was photobashed. And this is once again the cost of accuracy versus time. I thought it was going to be quicker for me to photobash the hand in, and it's true because it was quicker and more efficient. But I do feel even now looking at it that it did cost me quite a bit of accuracy. So it's something that you have to decide what kind of artist that you want to be. Do you want to be known for creating very accurate, well-defined things, with the price of being a little bit slower, a little bit less daring in your designs, perhaps? Or do you want to be remembered for fresh, fast designs, but not necessarily well constructed, I should say? I don't think there is an extreme of the two, but probably there is. But for me, I'm always trying to find a good balance, but I tend to lean towards, well, good execution first. So maybe 60% good execution and the remaining 40% is idea and design. And sometimes it's 70-30 in favor of good execution. This is probably due to my background working in the servicing line. I've worked with many smart and talented art directors as well as directors. And for me, I love working with their brain. I love working with their raw intensity of the ideas. So I find it I can be more useful if I'm the person that they can rely on for accuracy and good construction in my work. And I could rely on them for fresh, new takes or new perspectives on design. But again, it depends on what kind of person that you work with and what kind of artist do you want to market yourself as. So even in Photoshop, I'm still applying my PSD system or my PSD belief, where the first thing I'm trying to solve is proportions. First thing I'm trying to solve is fixing the gestures on the hands. So you see me mess around quite a bit, just replacing textures of some of these parts with what I think is more accurate from the gesture and perspective and 3D form perspective, 3D form angle. So I'm just replacing the hands now. I'm using a screenshot of actually a Metal Gear Solid 5 character model, which is Venom Snake himself. And now here I'm liquefying my character just to tweak that arm a little bit. But I love using 3D renders as textures. I think they always have really good resolution on them. And let me just backtrack really quick, and you can see me, I'm just using the hue and saturation and just changing the red channel to something different. So I the iPhone 11 Pro, Midnight Green, I just wanted to try that color scheme. It just has such a sexy, modern military look to it. It does connect well with the whole Raven / Undertaker / Undead Soldier thing, so... But I've designed so many black characters, and I love the color black. I love the color gray, but I figured just give it a shot and try a slightly, very lightly tinted color on him. And I absolutely love it. I did tone it down in the final, but it's very similar to the iPhone 11 Pro Midnight Green, where it's just under certain lighting would you see the hue. Yeah, so going back to my use of 3D models, I love them because most of the time 3D artists, when they show their work or their portfolio, they will render the back views, they render side views, and the resolutions are usually insanely good. And they're such a good resource for me for understanding materials clearly. For me, my biggest lesson of creating artwork was to first ask myself, who is my artwork going to be most meaningful or useful for, right? Because you're creating artwork for someone eventually. So if I'm going to create a character design, and if I know that only the director is going to see it, then the director is most interested about the storytelling aspect of it. So I can keep it really rough because I know that a director doesn't care about the details. I mean, he might like it, but ultimately what he needs to know is, does it reflect the storytelling narrative that he or she is trying to reflect? And a napkin sketch honestly could do that. And that's kind of why you see in certain art books, like you might notice some designs in that book are really rough, really loose. It's not that the artist is bad or anything or doesn't know how to paint in detail. It's just that they don't find it necessary because the goal is narrative, goal is storytelling. When I work in video games or designing characters for the video games, my artworks tend to go almost immediately to a character modeler, right? Because they tend to turn my designs in 3D. And what a character model needs is as much information as he or she can get so that they can accurately recreate my design in 3D and that they don't have to imagine or redesign anything. So fidelity is key when it comes to people like modelers who need my design, right? So in this case, I am thinking of an artwork that will be useful for a 3D modeler, which is why I'm selecting a lighting that is very clean, very easy to understand, because that will be the most useful for a 3D modeler, so it's not confusing. That's why you see exclusively in my portfolio, most of my characters are in a gray background with a white light. Because when your designs have a white light, whatever color you see on screen is the actual material color of your design. And that's very useful because when a 3D artist needs to recreate the materials, he or she needs to know the actual color of that said material without any filters or moods applied that might affect the hue and saturation of the said color. So think about that the next time you work. Just you can give yourself an imaginary client or an imaginary person that will take over your work. Try to think from their shoes, from their perspective. What would be the most useful to them? And of course, ideally, if you're the person that is creating artwork for everyone else, you're going to be loved by the people who hire you. You're going to be so valuable to the team because you're basically the most unselfish person in the team because you're trying to make everyone's lives easier. And I think that's a mark of a professional designer or a professional concept artist. My job is to make it easy for everyone else to work, not more difficult. And that's one big part, right? So next time you're ever thinking about how detailed your work should be, maybe instead of asking a concept artist or fellow illustrator, ask a 3D modeler, ask a character modeler. What do they need? What do they need to see to understand your design better? What do they need to know to reduce any confusion or misunderstanding? And definitely you'll get a much more valuable perspective on how to be a more, not better artist per se, but more useful artist. And for me, if talking to the pipeline, the rest of the artists in the pipeline, like animators or 3D modelers, that gives me my answer to how detailed my design should be. I like to talk to writers and directors usually to find out what value I can add. And essentially a good design is balancing these two things, value and detail. So details are useful because they're basically instructions of what you need in your design to recreate it in another format, let's say in 3D. But value is what your design brings to the table in terms of narrative and visual value. And the best people to ask that are usually your directors, game directors, or film directors per se, because they are most concerned about the narrative value of every single element that is on screen. So I like to ask kind of human questions, I should say, whenever I quiz my clients. The easiest ones are, what do you want your audience to feel? What do you want your players to feel at this moment when they see the character walk on screen the first time? And you want to be as detailed as you can with your question, because a general statement of, oh, I want them to feel like it's a cool character might not be enough, because how do you define cool? Like, is it cool in the perspective of it's just badass from a technology perspective, or is it cool because of the way the face is? And different narratives, different stories require different methods of portraying that. And of course, the other time as well is like, maybe you don't want the character to stand out. Maybe the character needs to blend in the rest of the environment, to blend in with the rest of the narrative, because perhaps you have a main character that's more important. So I'll be asking questions like this to figure out what's the human aspect that I need to know. Okay, so jumping back, this is a little trick that I like to use. I'm using a duplicated layer, and I'm applying what we call a find edges. It's under filter, stylize, find edges. And what that creates for me is a kind of outline version of my design, which I can use as a selection tool to select basically all the blacks, all the whites, and use it to quickly create nice scuff marks or edge details to my design. As you can see here, I'm just the selection is actually still there, but it's just hidden, and I'm just adding a lighter line across all the edges and darker lines, just to represent like oxidation after a surface has been scuffed or scratched off. So you're essentially playing with dark and light materials depending on the surface. You can see here this automatic rifle is benefiting a lot from that boost of detail. I toned this down quite substantially at the end, but let's say you're submitting just a rough sketch and you want to get a feedback early, but you don't want to submit something that's too rough. This is a nice way of adding definition and detail without using up too much time. So it's just a flattened layer. You go to filter, stylize, and find edges. And then what will happen is that you'll get this kind of a funky black and white picture with lines on it. And normally what I do is I use levels to contrast it a little bit so that I get clear definition between the lines. And then I'll use a magic wand to select all of the inner lines. And this gives me a great selection tool to find, basically to preserve edge detail. So now I'm just kind of adding a bit of color variety using a texture brush, just making the surface look much more aged. And this was mainly to establish the materials that I wanted, because for me, I needed to see for myself as well whether this was in the right direction. This wasn't necessarily the final finish that I was going for. I ended up repainting the entire armor surface, I think about 2 times, but it's perfectly normal. For me, it's all about doing it fast, making the mistakes fast, and seeing the mistakes fast so that you can actually make an informed decision about what you want to change. I see a lot of my students when they do work, when they paint the character, they hesitate so much. They hesitate so much and so often that end up you're kind of stuck in a paralysis of not putting anything on paper. And for me, it's like, how can you know something's not right before you first apply it on the canvas itself? And you apply it, you have to evaluate it, you have to let it sink in first even. And if that fails, try another route, and that fails, try. And that's the process of learning as well, because you're teaching yourself what workflows work for your current mindset and skill set level. So definitely fail fast, I would say, and fail early. That way you get all of the bad methods and bad outcomes out of the way. Because it's really difficult to work with someone who, if you're trying to give feedback as an art director, as a lecturer, and you tell them, hey, like the surface of the armor doesn't look right, and then their reply is, oh, I know, but I don't know how to do it. And well, I would prefer an answer along the lines of, yeah, I've tried several methods and I think this is the best one I can do. Do you mind telling me, is there a better way to do it? That would have at least shown some better initiative about how you're trying to teach yourself in the future. So in my classroom demo, I think the last concern I had was detail. So I'm intentionally moving fast and I'm intentionally omitting a lot of micro details because I was more in favor of showing my classroom the entire process per se. So I was hoping to tell them that this is how you could work in entirety, right? So I only had 2 hours because my classrooms are about 4 hours long. It's really long enough. And with a 2-hour demo, the remaining 2 hours tend to be for lectures and feedback sessions and whatnot. So, but what I was hoping to show was that within 2 hours, you could pull off something like this, and it's going to be this pipeline and this workflow. So if you had 20 hours, you ideally will have something like this, but with more fidelity and more finish. And that's how I always love to approach design. You must be able to create a low resolution version of your final design within a short time span. I'm going to try and phrase this as carefully as I can because I want to be clear about this. What I found out with reviewing even some of my staff work, my artists in my studio, is that their rough design is not a rough representation of the final design. Which is what you want. You want your rough artwork to be just a low resolution version of your final artwork. Not a initial idea which you decide is no longer a good idea by the time you reach the final. So if you find yourself hyper correcting your work the longer you work on it, meaning when you're supposed to add detail, you end up changing an entire part of a design, that means your initial design wasn't ready to go into final render to begin with. So a low resolution version of your final should have everything that you want in your final design, but they're just not properly fleshed out in resolution yet. But it has everything that you want to put in and you will put in already in place. And this is important because whenever you work with a client, they're not gonna call you. They're not gonna just give you money and then you just deliver the final product. They want to be informed throughout the entire process because they're working with a lot of moving pieces as well, and they want to know where your design is going every step of the way. And so being transparent with how your rough design is approaching and being able to lock your rough design early is a very good thing because it makes everyone in the entire production feel safe and feel more organized because they know that, okay, like the design is locked. I can use this in my blocking, my scene or whatever. You just need a couple more days to tighten it up for the production people. And if you come back with a new concept that's totally different from what you agreed upon in the rough sketch, that's going to create all kinds of problems for the production. Because no one's expecting that. No one is is used to that design and they weren't on board. And if you have outside investors, if you have other people who are necessary for the approval of the design, suddenly having the need to call all of them back again because you changed something at the last minute is really expensive, really problematic, and really not recommended in your work. So being able to communicate your design accurately in a rough format, just that it's low resolution, is super important to being a professional concept artist. So at the end of this video, you'll see that I just did a time skip where I'll show you the final artwork, or you've actually just seen the final artwork at the start of this video. It's relatively the same. I think the only difference is that resolution has been added instead. And trust me, it's not easy because it's incredibly tempting to make changes as you feel like it throughout the whole process of your work. It's very tempting to make that last minute tweak, to say something along the lines of, what, I don't like that shoulder pad anymore. I'm going to get rid of it. Unfortunately, that decision might not be the most accurate one because maybe you're just fatigued, right? Maybe you're just, because you're staring at this art for so long, you're being hypercritical towards it. And so now you're making a design decision that is unfounded, right? Purely because you just design fatigue, you've been staring at it for too long. So it's not really an informed art decision anymore. It's important to understand, like, there must have been a reason why you opted for this shoulder to begin with, or this design element to begin with. And again, this is why I think it's so important to test out as many ideas as you can in the early stages. Fail early, fail fast, so that by the time you head to the render stage, you are absolutely sure that everything is on your design at the moment is what you've experimented, what you've proven to be the most appropriate design possible that you can think of, and that you won't change anything moving down the line. So I want to talk a bit about design in terms of if you cannot draw or redraw your design in a simplified format, like what you see now, I'm essentially redrawing my character how like a kid would redraw my character, right? With all the elements in place. This is a great way to evaluate the effectiveness or the memorability, how easy it is to remember your design. Can you recreate your design out of memory really easily, or can a lay person, just a random person off the streets, do a fan art of your design really quickly without having to constantly reference your work? Does it have enough simplistic visual landmarks? White half skull head, midnight green armor, red eyes, red flat LED slit eyes, one gas mask filter tube on the right hand side of the face. Right, these are all simple, easy to remember landmarks, visual landmarks that kind of create this design that I have here. So drawing a cute version or a primitive version or icon version, that's a great way to evaluate whether your design is easy to understand, or is it maybe perhaps too convoluted or too complex. So now that I have more of the design complete, I'm going to go in to start fleshing out the accessories, starting with the weapon. And I'm not a really good weapon designer. I don't pride myself on it. I don't necessarily look at weapons too much as well, but for me, what I like is I try to look at it as a sculpture. And for me, sculpture should have a nice balance, both in visual detail, noise detail, as well as silhouette. And that's generally how I like to approach my weapons. I'm not really savvy with, not too savvy with like where the bullet should eject, or how big a bullet should be with respect to the size of the rifle, etc. Um, Purely because it's not a field of design that I've really looked into just yet. I tend to focus more on character and narratives, and I actually believe that there are so many much better weapon designers out there in the field that, um, for me, if I focus on a good silhouette of a weapon, that person could jump in and add the necessary knowledge and realism into it, and it would just add on to my design really well. So what I'm focusing on with texture just now is just to make sure that the surface detail shows the scale of the weapon correctly, and that it has a nice shape to it, a nice form factor to it that felt correct in the sense of the tech level, as well as the personality of this soldier, right? Because I don't want this soldier to be too ornate or anything like that. It was just a simple yet strong, very practical weapon, which is what I was looking for. So it was kind of a no nonsense shape. So I wasn't trying to add too much with like glowing lights or LED scopes or anything like that. So I didn't want to make it too far tech wise as well. I kind of like just very simple, strong, grounded shapes for my weapons. So here, for whatever reason, I'm just having problems with my line tool, but I just decided to paint it in itself. It was creating like a weird symmetry for whatever reason. So for me, an artwork of this level of finishing, as I mentioned earlier, it took me about 2 hours to get to this point, and it's, despite it being quite rough and loose in terms of details, it does express everything that I'm trying to express from a design perspective. And I could easily stop here and maybe start on another variant, another character, and within a 8-hour working day, which is a very healthy working lifestyle, I could create four options of this, four options of characters with 3/4 front, 3/4 back, full color. And that's a really worthwhile workday, right? Four full character sheets that you can submit to your client, let them think about the design, let them figure out what exactly works, what doesn't. And to me, that is a really productive workflow. Because I think if you get too caught up with detail, you have to remember that maybe someone else could take over that. Like if you're trying to find the most value for your time, ideally as a concept artist, your value comes from your ideas and your explorations of design. They could easily take over the detail side from themselves. They could easily, maybe they have a very good 3D artist that likes to add details themselves, so they don't need a detailed concept. So it's important to understand how you want to use your time to add value to the team that you're working for. So at this point, I'm quite happy with how everything is blocked out. And I'm kind of ready to go into the, very likely the detail stage of the design. So even though this is still a fairly low resolution image, I wanted to try and start to tackle the low resolution details on him as well. And I believe that the final thing I did was start to play around with decals or stickers, which I'll talk a bit more in detail in a bit. So what I'm thinking of adding on now is just a little bit more grit and grime on the armor. The material in my head that I had was some kind of a matte finish painted armor, but I think I added a little bit more shine in the final. And what I'm looking for now is actually a nice padded square pattern that I could put on his skirt. And so this sofa worked really well. It had some nice curvature to it as well in the texture itself, so it allowed me to have the pattern kind of curve naturally around his body. And these are all details, right? These are like details that help define the surface better. And I love adding textures that you can visually see the tactileness of the surface. So most of the textures that I like to think about are fairly large in surface detail, for example. I like to imagine it as something that you could run your fingers through and you could really feel the bumps. Not something subtle like a basketball where there's just tiny, tiny bumps. I mean, those are important, but for me, especially with the character design, you're looking for much larger textures to portray. Like you can't really see a denim pants material from a distance. You really don't. It just looks like almost every other cloth. But if someone's wearing a leather padded jacket with little squares, then you definitely could see it from afar. So I'm more concerned about these larger to medium-sized ones. For me, my mindset to adding texture, this kind of large visible textures, is to play around with jumps. So a jump is when you have a detail and then no detail, right? So I'm kind of just making sure that there are nice gaps between sections that have nice texture detail to sections that are just a little bit more simple and flat in surface. And it's this balance between the two surface properties, I think, that create visual rhythm, I should say. It's like a beat. You don't want the beat to just be hyper consistent. You want the beat to have a rhythm. Fast and then slow, loud and then soft. And applying your textures in design works in a very similar way. If I were to apply this padded square texture across the entire costume, it'll be too consistent to the point where the beat would just be all over and the whole piece would lack any sense of rhythm. And that will work the same if I were to remove all forms of texture. You will create what will be a very quiet piece that might not have anything to say. So now I'm going to start to add some decals, which is the final detail and decal section. And I decided to use some Gundam model kit stickers because I think they have a nice variety and there's plenty of access to decent resolution versions of them. Of course, ideally you want to create your own decals, but in the classroom setting, this was the fastest thing that I could pick up from the web. So decals are great because they do a couple of things. Like first, they add scale. When you see a very small text on a surface like this, it automatically gives visual scale and visual weight to the entire design. Because if you see a huge surface and the texts are tiny, you know that without any other scale reference that this probably is a large object. And vice versa. You can make something small by adding larger decals on it. The other thing it does really well is also it adds this extra layer of detail that makes items more grounded, because anything that's manufactured by humans are labeled to some degree, either with a brand or a warning label or barcode or some kind of instructional label. So it just shows that there's an end user connected to this product, and it really adds a lot of human touch to a design. So that's why you see it really prevalent in science fiction design. It does add a lot of that extra oomph to the whole piece. So in fantasy art, a decal could be easily replaced with a emblem or a brooch, or a icon of whatever tribe or whatever religious group or whatever king that your character is serving, right? So it's really the same. Characters have always been carrying some form of iconography forever. So even if you're designing like a high school student, right, the t-shirt, the logo on the t-shirt is a decal that would represent the character. That's a character like rock music. That's a character like hip hop. So what pattern would reflect that on the outfit? If they're wearing shoes, is it an expensive brand? Is it a cheap brand? And sometimes logos could connect that, right? We can understand designs through logos, even through graphics. And like I said prior, fantasy characters, the Templar Knights, for example, the red cross or the red crucifix is prevalent in almost the entire costume. It's on their chest, it's on their helmet. So a decal actually does substantial work to unify your design together. And if you're doing a set of characters, letting them share the decals really helps bridge all of the designs together to make them look like a set, even though they are fairly different characters. So once I added all of these smaller decals in, I wanted to create like an emblem or a military logo for him, for this character, the Death Trooper. So in this part, I was looking for something like maybe a seal or a military seal, and I kind of landed on a cobra. I thought cobras would be cool, and it was just a quick decision. It was nothing too well thought of. In the final concept, I later changed it to a raven skull, as I started to play with the concept of the Carrion Guard, how their base logo is reflective of ravens and crows, and I would change the logo at the end. But the technique that I'm applying the logo still applies. It's grabbing a nice vector image or 2D image and then modifying it, or repainting it for that matter, to make it your own. So if you're doing this for money, definitely don't just grab someone's logo off the web and putting it in. You definitely don't want to do that, because just from a legal and moral perspective, it's totally wrong. I'm just doing this here, and that's the reason why I changed it in the end. I'm just doing it here just to show you how you would use a texture. So it's important to make sure that your texture is correctly curved or warped around the surface that it's supposed to be stuck on. So in this case, it's a rounded cylindrical shoulder armor. So it's necessary for me to warp this sticker or this logo to fit. Second thing you want to do is make sure that the condition of the sticker reflects the condition of the surface, right? So this is a worn outfit, a worn armor, so the sticker or decal should be worn out as well and scuffed and scratched at the right places. If this was a new suit of armor, then I would just leave it as is, maybe just play around with the values to make it integrated a bit better. So we're at the final minute of this tutorial, so I'm just going on with my brush and just kind of adding any last minute details. At this point, they could tell my students were getting restless because it's already been a 2.5-hour demo, which I try not to do. So I'm just kind of moving around really quickly, frantically trying to add details before I wrap this thing up. When I took it back to my studio, um, I gave every surface a resolution pass. It's very similar to what I do if my design gets approved. I would research on new high resolution textures and just start to rebash the entire surface while retaining the design aesthetic and lighting of my rough low resolution design image here. I think I made substantial changes to the skull purely because I thought it looked a little bit under sculpted and under shaped. And you can see here the refined version is much more polished and definitely much more well thought of. Alright, so that basically summarizes this video. It's a really fun one as I love painting this kind of things. I've been getting a lot of good questions through comments on YouTube, so if you have any questions about how I work or a little bit more in-depth, please let me know there. If you thought this video was useful and helpful, please like and subscribe. And if you want to get the higher res image, feel free to grab it from my ArtStation. Thank you for listening. Take care.